What if the world we know never came to be? Imagine for a moment, a globe spinning on a different axis of power, a planet where the familiar red, white, and blue banner of the United States never cast such a long and defining shadow. Consider a reality where America, the colossus that has shaped so much of the modern era, remained merely a large nation among many, its voice a murmur rather than a roar in the chorus of global affairs. How would life look, feel, and sound without the pervasive influence of American politics, its formidable economy, and its seemingly inescapable culture? This is not just an academic exercise, it is a profound inquiry into the very nature of the 20th and 21st centuries, a journey into a past that could have been, and a present that might have followed. The question forces us to unravel the tapestry of our own time, to pull at the threads of history until the familiar patterns dissolve. Without an American-led order, who would have set the rules? Who would have enforced them? The assumptions that underpin our daily lives, from the currency used in global trade to the movies we watch on a Friday night, would be rendered uncertain. The great struggles of the last century, the Cold War chief among them, would have unfolded along entirely different battle lines. Alliances would have shifted. Ideologies would have found new champions and new adversaries. The very map of the world, both political and psychological, would have been redrawn in ways we can only begin to fathom. This alternate world challenges our perception of progress and destiny. Was America's rise to superpower status and inevitability a manifest destiny written into the fabric of its founding principles and vast resources? Or was it the result of a series of specific choices made at critical junctures, a cascade of events that could have easily tumbled in another direction? To explore this alternate timeline is to confront the fragility of history itself. It is to understand that the world we inhabit is not a finished product but a dynamic and often unpredictable creation shaped by decisions both grand and small, by triumphs celebrated and opportunities lost. The absence of one dominant power creates a void, and nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. The story of this other world begins not with what happened but with what did not. It is a tale of silence, where we expect a declaration of inaction, where we anticipate a charge. It's a world without the Marshall Plan's lifeline to a shattered Europe, without the Truman Doctrine's defiant stand, without the omnipresent hum of American industry driving a global economic engine. In this quieted landscape, other voices would have risen, other ambitions would have taken flight. The narrative of global power would have been written in different languages, guided by different philosophies, and aimed toward different ends. And in this unfamiliar world, the United States itself would be a profoundly different place, its potential unfulfilled, its gaze turned inward. America did not stumble into its role as a global hegemon. It was forged in the fires of industry, war, and ideology over the course of a transformative century. The seeds of its power were sown long before, in the vast, resource-rich continent it came to occupy. But it was the late 19th and early 20th centuries that saw the nation truly awaken. A torrent of industrialization, fueled by steel, oil, and electricity, turned the United States into the world's manufacturing heartland. Factories churned out goods at a scale never before seen. Railroads stitched the country together, creating a massive, unified domestic market that incubated immense corporate power and technological innovation. It was an era of raw, untamed growth, a period that laid the economic foundation for everything that was to come. Then came the wars. The First World War marked America's debut on the global stage as a significant military and financial power. While Europe bled itself dry in the trenches, the United States emerged relatively unscathed, its industries booming and its coffers full. It transformed from a debtor nation into the world's leading creditor. But it was the Second World War that served as the true crucible. America became the arsenal of democracy, its factories producing a staggering volume of ships, planes, and tanks that overwhelmed the Axis powers. Victory in 1945 left the United States in a position of unparalleled dominance. Its cities were intact, its economy was supercharged, and it alone possessed the terrifying power of the atomic bomb. In the aftermath of the war, American leaders made a series of deliberate choices to shape a new global order. At a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, they established an economic system that would define the post-war era. The US dollar was crowned the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold, and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created to promote stability and American-led capitalism. This was not just about economics. It was about building a world that was safe for American interests. The Marshall Plan followed a massive infusion of aid that rebuilt Western Europe, created loyal allies and opened up vast markets for American goods. It was an act of both generosity and shrewd self-interest. The final element was the Cold War. The ideological struggle against the Soviet Union provided the ultimate justification for America's global posture. The threat of communism galvanized the nation, leading to the creation of a permanent military-industrial complex and a network of alliances like NATO that encircled the globe. For nearly half a century, every foreign policy decision was viewed through the prism of this bipolar conflict. America projected its power into every corner of the planet, fighting proxy wars, engaging in espionage, and racing to the moon. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States stood alone, the undisputed victor, the sole superpower in a unipolar world. This was the summit of its ascent. Now, let us imagine a different path. Let us rewind the clock to a crucial moment of decision. The year is 1941. The forces of the Axis powers are sweeping across Europe and Asia. But in this alternate history, the attack on Pearl Harbor does not galvanize the American public into a unified call for war. Instead, the powerful isolationist sentiment that had defined the nation for decades holds firm. Figures like Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee succeed in persuading the populace that this is Europe's war, not America's. The United States provides some material support, a lender of last resort, but it never fully commits its industrial might or the blood of its soldiers to the conflict. It remains on the sidelines, a wary observer to the world's conflagration. Without the full weight of American industry and military power, the course of World War II changes dramatically. The war in Europe becomes a far longer, more brutal slog. Perhaps the Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of the Nazi war machine, eventually manages to push the German army back to Berlin, but at a catastrophic cost. The victory is solely theirs, and they stand as the undisputed masters of the continent from the Ural Mountains to the English Channel. In the Pacific, the Japanese Empire might consolidate its gains, creating its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and fighting the British Commonwealth and a weakened China to a bloody stalemate. The world that emerges from this conflict is not one of American triumph, but one of exhaustion and regional dominance by other, more ruthless powers. In this reality, there is no Bretton Woods Conference to establish an American-led economic order. There is no Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. The continent remains shattered, impoverished, and largely under the thumb of the Soviet Union. The United States, having avoided the immense costs of war, is economically stable but politically irrelevant on the world stage. It never develops the vast military-industrial complex that defined its Cold War identity. It possesses no global network of bases, no far-reaching alliances. NATO is never born. The United Nations might exist, but without American leadership and funding, it is a far weaker, more fractious organization, a debating society with little real power. The Cold War, as we knew it, never happens. Instead, a different kind of global tension emerges. The primary conflict might be between a dominant, expansionist Soviet Union and a wary but powerful British Empire, clinging to its global trade routes and Commonwealth allies. Or perhaps a new power bloc emerges in Asia, with China, free from a full-scale Japanese invasion prolonged by American involvement, beginning its rise much earlier. India, upon gaining its independence, might navigate this multipolar world to become a leader of a non-aligned movement with real teeth. The United States, in this scenario, is a bystander, a large but insular nation focused on its own hemisphere, its superpower destiny left unrealized. In a world without American supremacy, the global power vacuum would not remain empty for long. The most immediate beneficiary would have been the Soviet Union. Emerging as the principal victor over Nazi Germany in Europe, Moscow's influence would have been immense and, honestly, pretty terrifying. A Red Army that marched to Berlin without American or British support on a second front would have had little to stop it from continuing to the Atlantic. A continent-spanning Soviet bloc controlling the industrial heartlands of Germany and the resources of Eastern Europe would have been a formidable empire. Its command economy, though brutal and inefficient, would have directed the reconstruction of a continent in its own image, creating a sphere of influence far larger and more secure than it ever achieved in our history. Across the English Channel, a diminished but still proud Great Britain would have led a different kind of bloc. The British Commonwealth, a network of nations bound by history, culture, and trade, could have evolved into a more robust political and economic alliance. Without the overwhelming presence of the United States, Britain would have been forced to maintain its global military posture, its Royal Navy still ruling many of the waves. London, not New York, might have remained the world's financial center. This British-led alliance, perhaps encompassing Canada, Australia, India, and parts of Africa, would have stood as a primary counterweight to Soviet ambitions, creating a bipolar world, but one with a very different character and geography. Further east, the trajectory of Asia would be completely altered. Without an American presence to guarantee the security of Japan and South Korea, the region's destiny would be up for grabs. China, under either nationalist or communist rule, would have faced a different set of challenges and opportunities. A communist China, without the American enemy to focus on, might have had a more contentious relationship with its Soviet neighbor, leading to an earlier and more dramatic Sino-Soviet split. Alternatively, a consolidated Japanese empire, undefeated by the United States, could have become the dominant regional power, its technological prowess and military discipline creating an Asian order centered on Tokyo, not Beijing or Washington. And we cannot forget the potential of other rising nations. India, with its vast population and democratic traditions, might have forged a powerful third way. As the undisputed leader of the post-colonial world, it could have built a non-aligned movement that was not just a political statement but a genuine economic and military force. Brazil, with its immense resources, could have become the unquestioned leader of a more independent and unified South America. The world would not be unipolar or even bipolar, it would be a complex multipolar system of competing empires and alliances. Power would be more diffuse, but conflict might be more frequent, a constant shifting dance of regional hegemons vying for advantage. The cultural landscape of a world without an American superpower would be almost unrecognizable. The single most dominant force in global popular culture for the last 75 years would be absent. Imagine, just for a moment, a world without Hollywood's universal dream machine. The cinematic language that has taught the world how to frame a story, how to depict heroism, and how to dream of romance would be just one of many local dialects. Film industries in other nations, perhaps the grand studios of Britain, the auteur-driven cinema of France, or the vibrant productions of India's Bollywood, would have filled the void. The stories, heroes, and values exported to the world would be profoundly different, shaping a global consciousness with other myths and other aspirations. The soundtrack of modern life would also change its tune. There would be no global dominance of American rock and roll, jazz, or hip-hop. These art forms would certainly exist, but they would remain largely regional expressions, not the universal anthems of youth and rebellion. The airwaves might instead be filled with the pop music of Britain, the chansons of Paris, or the cinematic scores of Mumbai. The very rhythm of global culture would be different, less centralized and more diverse. The iconic brands that serve as a kind of cultural shorthand across the planet, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Nike, would likely be minor players, replaced by other corporate titans from Germany, Japan, or the United Kingdom. Perhaps the most significant cultural shift would be the status of the English language. While the legacy of the British Empire would ensure English remained an important international language, it would not have achieved its current status as the undisputed global lingua franca. Without America's economic, technological, and cultural dominance to propel it, English would likely share the stage with other powerful languages. French might have retained its position as the language of diplomacy, German could have become the language of European commerce, and Russian the language of a vast Eurasian bloc. International business, science, and the internet itself would be a more multilingual, fragmented space, requiring translation and negotiation rather than assuming a common tongue. This cultural fragmentation would mean a less homogenized world. The powerful currents of Americanization, which have brought both immense opportunity and deep resentment, would never have flowed. Local cultures might have remained more distinct, less influenced by the magnetic pull of American trends and consumerism. While this could be seen as a preservation of diversity, it might also mean a world that is less interconnected, more insular, and perhaps more prone to misunderstanding. The shared cultural experiences that, for better or worse, have been provided by American media would not exist, leaving a world of distinct cultural islands with fewer bridges connecting them. The global village would feel a lot less like a village. The global economic system would operate on entirely different principles in a world without an American superpower. The Bretton Woods Agreement, which established the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency, would never have happened. This single fact changes everything. International trade would not be denominated in dollars. Instead, A basket of competing currencies, perhaps the British pound sterling, the Soviet ruble, or a German-led European currency, would vie for dominance. This would create a more volatile and complex financial world. Countries could not rely on the stability of the United States Treasury bond as a safe haven asset, and the global flow of capital would follow different, less predictable paths. Technological innovations so closely associated with American hubs like Silicon Valley would be far more decentralized. Without the massive Cold War-era defense spending that fueled the development of the internet, GPS, and microchips in the United States, the technological frontier would have advanced differently. Perhaps the lead in computing would have been taken by research centers in Cambridge, England, or Tokyo, Japan. German engineering might have dominated the fields of robotics and advanced manufacturing. The global tech landscape would be a patchwork of specialized hubs, each with its own standards and ecosystems, rather than a world dominated by a handful of American giants like Apple, Google, and Microsoft. The very model of global capitalism would be contested. The American model, with its emphasis on free markets, deregulation, and shareholder value, would not be the default template for economic success. Instead, the world would see a more pronounced competition between different economic philosophies. The social market economy of a German-led Europe, emphasizing stakeholder capitalism and strong social safety nets, would offer one powerful alternative. The state-directed capitalism of Japan or a rising China would present another, and the command and control socialism of the Soviet bloc would remain a formidable force, controlling the economic destiny of a huge portion of the globe. There would be no Washington consensus to impose on developing nations. This economic multipolarity would have profound consequences for global development and trade. Trade blocs would likely be more rigid and protectionist, centered around their respective hegemonic powers. A European bloc, a Soviet bloc, a British Commonwealth bloc. Each would trade preferentially within its sphere, making global free trade a distant dream. Developing nations would have to navigate these competing systems, aligning themselves with one patron or another to gain access to markets and capital. The absence of a single dominant economic engine like the post-war United States would likely mean slower overall global growth, but perhaps a more balanced, if more fractured distribution of industrial power. The political architecture of the modern world would be fundamentally different. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the cornerstone of Western security for over 70 years, would not exist. This alliance was a direct product of American leadership and its commitment to defend Western Europe against Soviet expansionism. Without that American security guarantee, the political map of Europe would look vastly different. Nations would have been forced into one of two camps, either seeking accommodation with the powerful Soviet Union next door, or banding together in a purely European defense pact. Such a European alliance, lacking the overwhelming power of the United States, would have been a far more fragile and anxious entity, constantly looking over its shoulder at the Colossus to the east. The United Nations itself would be a shadow of its current form. While the organization might still have been founded, its headquarters would likely be in Geneva or London, not New York. Without the immense financial contributions and political weight of the United States, its resolutions would carry less authority, and its peacekeeping missions would be fewer and less effective. The Security Council would be a stage for the raw power politics of competing regional hegemons, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, China, unmediated by a single dominant superpower. The institution would more closely resemble its failed predecessor, the League of Nations, a forum for debate rather than a mechanism for collective action. Global alignments would be fluid and treacherous. The Cold War created a stark, bipolar simplicity for many nations. You were with Washington, or you were with Moscow. In a multipolar world, allegiances would be far more complex and transactional. A country might align with the British on trade, the Soviets on security, and a rising Asian power on technology. This would create a landscape of constant diplomatic maneuvering, a high-stakes chess game where loyalties were temporary and betrayal was a constant risk. The concept of a free world led by the United States would be meaningless. Instead, there would be multiple competing visions of order, each backed by a formidable regional power and its network of client states. This fractured world might also be a more dangerous one. The nuclear genie, once out of the bottle, would still exist. But without the bipolar standoff of the Cold War, which created a terrifying but stable balance of terror, nuclear proliferation could have been far more rampant. Regional powers, lacking the security umbrella of a superpower, would have had a much stronger incentive to develop their own atomic weapons as the ultimate guarantee of their sovereignty. A world with a dozen nuclear-armed states, each with its own rivalries and flashpoints, could have been a world living on a perpetual knife's edge, far closer to the brink of atomic catastrophe than even the darkest days of our own Cold War. And what of America itself in this alternate reality? The United States would be a nation transformed, or rather, a nation that never transformed. It would be a large, wealthy, and powerful country, but its power would be confined largely to its own hemisphere. It would be a regional hegemon, a big brother to Canada and Latin America, but its voice would carry little weight in the great capitals of Europe and Asia. Its foreign policy would be guided by an enduring isolationism, a deep-seated reluctance to become entangled in the perennial conflicts of the Old World. The Monroe Doctrine would be the beginning and end of its grand strategy, to keep foreign powers out of the Americas. Internally, the country would be more divided. The great national project of the Cold War, the unifying struggle against a global ideological foe, would never have occurred. Without that common enemy, the deep-seated divisions in American society, regional, racial, and political, might have festered without resolution. The civil rights movement would have happened, but it would have unfolded without the backdrop of a Cold War contest for the hearts and minds of the world, potentially altering its course and its outcome. The federal government would be a smaller, less powerful entity, lacking the vast national security apparatus that grew to define it in the second half of the 20th century. The American economy would be prosperous but insular. Its great corporations would serve a large domestic market, but they would not be the globe-spanning behemoths we know today. The nation's focus would be inward, on building its own society, largely indifferent to the great power struggles shaping the rest of the world. It might be a more peaceful, perhaps even a more equitable society, having avoided the immense costs and moral compromises of being a global empire. But it would also be a more provincial one, its culture less dynamic, its worldview narrower, its sense of purpose less grand. The American dream would be a more modest, domestic affair. In the end, we are left with a profound reflection on the nature of power and progress. The world without an American superpower would not necessarily be better or worse, but it would be undeniably different. It would be a world without a single organizing principle, a more chaotic and contested space. Our very perception of history, of the march of progress, is colored by the American-led order that actually came to be. To imagine its absence is to see that nothing was inevitable. History is not a straight line, but a branching path of possibilities. The world we live in is just one of those paths, a world shaped, for good and for ill, by the momentous and historically unique rise of the United States to global supremacy.